She warned me I was crossing a line. I smiled, because she was the one who kept stepping closer. I hadn't planned to stop at that cafe. It was one of those late afternoons where the sky wore a pale gold, the kind that makes you pause between where you've been and where you're going. I pushed open the door, expecting nothing more than a cup of coffee to push me through the rest of the day. Instead, I found her. She sat near the window, a book open in her hands, steam curling from the mug beside her. Even after all these years, I knew her immediately. Ms. Hartley. My literature teacher, the woman who first taught me how words could live and breathe, how they could leave a mark long after the paper turned yellow. It had been 6 years since graduation, yet here she was, framed by the soft glow of the amber lights. Time had touched her gently. Her dark hair, now touched with threads of silver, was swept into a loose knot, a delicate scarf draped around her shoulders. There was a calmness in her posture, yet something about the way her fingers lightly traced the page told me she still carried that quiet fire I once admired from a distance. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should interrupt. Would she even remember me? Back then, I was just another boy in a crowded classroom, eager, restless, uncertain of the world. Now, at 24, I wasn't that boy anymore. But as I stood there, watching her, I realized something had shifted, not just in me, but in how I saw her. When she finally looked up, her eyes widened slightly. A slow, warm smile curved her lips. "Daniel?" she said, her voice a soft mixture of surprise and delight. Hearing my name in her voice brought back a rush of memories, essays she praised, moments she encouraged me when I doubted myself, the quiet authority she carried without ever raising her voice. I walked closer, my hands shoved awkwardly into my pockets. "It's been a long time, Ms. Hartley." She closed the book and gestured to the seat across from her. "Too long. Sit down, tell me everything. And please call me Claire. I'm not your teacher anymore." That single sentence made something stir inside me. Not my teacher anymore. I sat, feeling the familiar warmth of the cafe wrap around us as the world outside carried on, unaware that time had just bent a little between us. We spoke of simple things at first, the years gone by, the paths we'd taken. I noticed the faint lines near her eyes, the way her smile carried both wisdom and weariness. There was a grace about her now, one that didn't demand attention but quietly held it. As the minutes slipped into an hour, I found myself wondering, not about the past, but about the space that had just opened between us. It was as though the roles that once defined us had dissolved, leaving two people, both a little older, both a little lonelier than they cared to admit, sharing the same warm light on a quiet evening. The rain had begun while we spoke, a soft drizzle at first, then a steady rhythm that tapped against the cafe window. The city outside blurred into streaks of gray and gold, the kind of rain that makes you linger just a little longer than you intended. I didn't mind. Neither did she. Claire cupped her mug with both hands, her fingers slender and still bearing that graceful firmness I remembered from the way she once turned pages in class. Her scarf had loosened a little, a wisp of hair falling free and brushing her cheek. It struck me how effortlessly time had added depth to her presence. She was older, yes, but not in the way that diminishes. It was the kind of change that draws you in, like the way an old book feels more alive with its creases and notes in the margins. "So, what have you been doing all these years?" she asked, tilting her head slightly, her eyes bright but touched with a kind of weary curiosity. I told her about finishing university, about drifting between jobs until I found one that finally made sense, writing, in a small editorial office downtown. She smiled at that, a proud sort of smile, like a thread connecting back to the days when she read my essays aloud and told the class I had a voice worth honing. "And you?" I asked, more hesitant than I meant to be. Her gaze lowered for a moment. "Still teaching. Though, things are different now." She swirled her spoon slowly, the clink against porcelain filling the brief silence. "I went through a divorce last year. Nothing dramatic, just the end of something that had already grown quiet." There was no bitterness in her voice, only a kind of acceptance that carried its own weight. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, letting the rain speak for a moment. She looked back at me, her smile returning, softer this time. "It's strange," she said, "seeing you here after all these years. You've changed." Her eyes lingered, tracing my face as though cataloging the differences: stronger lines in my jaw, the faint scruff of a day-old beard, the steadier way I met her gaze now. "In good ways?" I asked, half joking, half hoping. "In good ways," she echoed, her lips curling slightly. There was a pause, just long enough to notice it. Her fingers reached for the sugar, passing it across the table. For a second, her hand brushed mine. It was accidental, of course, but the warmth of it stayed longer than it should have. She didn't pull away too quickly. Neither did I. We went on talking, about books, about how the school had changed, about the old library being replaced by something far too modern. Yet beneath every word was a quiet shift, a current that neither of us named. The rain outside softened to a mist, the cafe lights growing warmer as evening leaned in. And somewhere in that soft space between past and present, I realized I was no longer speaking to Miss Hartley, my teacher. I was speaking to Claire, just Claire. And that was the first, subtle change either of us could quite undo. It started to feel like the city had its own quiet plans for us. First the cafe, then a week later at the small independent bookstore tucked away on Elm Street. I was thumbing through a new release when I heard her voice behind me, soft, familiar, carrying the same measured warmth that once filled a classroom. "Still drawn to words, I see," Claire said, standing there with a paper bag of novels in one arm. I smiled, a little too quickly perhaps. "And you still have good timing." We exchanged a few words, nothing more than a casual hello and an unspoken recognition that this was no longer coincidence. Not entirely. The city is big, but our lives, it seemed, had narrowed into overlapping circles. A few days later, it was the park near the riverside. I was sitting on a bench, watching the leaves scatter with the early autumn wind. She appeared again, this time with a thermos of tea and a scarf wrapped high against her neck. She spotted me first, hesitated a second, then walked over. "Do you mind?" she asked, gesturing to the empty space beside me. "Not at all." The bench felt smaller with her there, not in an uncomfortable way, but in that subtle, magnetic kind of way where you become aware of space, how much you leave, how much you want to close. We talked about the weather, about the upcoming community event she was helping organize. It was all simple, ordinary, yet each exchange felt quietly weighted, like a string being drawn between us thread by thread. I began to notice the small things, how her fingers would tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear when she laughed, how the corners of her scarf fluttered against my sleeve when the wind picked up. One afternoon, as we walked side by side leaving the bookstore, a sudden gust pushed the fabric of her scarf across my chest. She reached out instinctively, her hand brushing my shoulder as she fixed it back into place. Her fingers lingered, only for a breath, but long enough for my pulse to notice. It was never planned. At least, that's what I told myself. But when you find someone in the same places again and again, when conversations grow easier, when the silences start to feel like company rather than pauses, you begin to wonder, who's leaving the door open? I caught her looking at me once, during a pause in our walk. Not a stare, not a slip, just a moment where her eyes softened as if measuring the distance between who I was and who I'd become. Friends would have called it coincidence. But as I walked home that evening, with the cool air still carrying the faint trace of her perfume, I started to think, coincidences don't linger like that. And maybe, either did we. The night of the community reading felt like autumn itself had wrapped around the town, cool air, the faint scent of damp leaves, and warm light spilling from the small hall where the event was held. Claire had been helping organize it for weeks, and I'd promised to attend. I stayed until the crowd began thinning, chatting with a few familiar faces before stepping outside. She was there, standing by the door with her coat draped over one arm, her cheeks touched pink from the evening air. "It's still early," she said, glancing at the dark sky. "Would you like some tea? I live just a few streets away." It sounded casual. It was casual. And yet, the way her voice dipped at the end, The way her eyes held mine for that fraction longer than they needed to, it made something stir in me that I tried to keep quiet. Her home was exactly as I imagined, shelves lined with books, soft lighting that made every corner feel warm, and the faint scent of lavender hanging in the air. She set the kettle on, slipping her scarf onto the back of a chair. "Make yourself comfortable," she said. "I'll be just a moment." I sat on the couch, fingers tracing the embroidered edge of a cushion. It felt strangely intimate, this space that belonged to her, this quiet hour when the world outside seemed to hush itself. When she returned with the tea, she sat beside me, leaving a careful space, though not too much. The steam rose between us, carrying the soft notes of chamomile. We talked at first about the event, the readers, the stories, but slowly the conversation wandered. "You were always so quiet in class," she said suddenly, her fingers curled around her cup. "But your words, they always found their way through." I smiled. I guess I was still figuring out what to say. There was a moment then, a stillness that wasn't empty. Her hand rested on the cushion between us, fingers close enough that I could feel the heat of them. I didn't move closer, but I didn't lean away either. She noticed. Of course, she did. Her gaze shifted to mine, steady, searching, something unspoken flickering in her eyes. And then, softly, almost like a breath, she said, "You're crossing the line." It wasn't sharp. It wasn't even a warning, not really. It was more like a truth spoken aloud, a line drawn with her voice, yet faint, like chalk on a rainy day. I could have stepped back. I could have filled the space with a laugh, a change of subject. But I didn't. I let the words hang there, the clock ticking softly behind us, the rain starting again on the windowpane. Her hand still rested close, her body still angled just slightly toward me. And in that moment I realized the line she spoke of wasn't just mine to cross. It had been moved, little by little, word by word, until now, it sat between us like something both of us had drawn together. The rain outside hadn't let up. It drummed softly against the windows, a steady rhythm that seemed to slow the world down. The clock in the corner ticked with quiet patience, the kind of silence that holds more weight than noise ever could. Claire sat with her teacup resting in her hands, her fingers curled gently around the warmth. Her earlier words lingered between us, "You're crossing the line." They hadn't been angry. If anything, they were hesitant, almost unsure. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on my knees, searching her face for something unspoken. There was a softness in her eyes, but also a wall she wasn't ready to let crumble just yet. "Maybe," I said quietly, "but only because you drew it closer." The words left my lips before I had time to doubt them. I didn't mean them as a challenge. I meant them as a truth, the kind you say softly, hoping the air catches them gently enough to keep them from breaking. She blinked, as if caught between surprise and something deeper. Her fingers tightened slightly on the cup, and for a moment she didn't speak. Then, a quiet laugh, not mocking, not dismissive, just a soft exhale of disbelief. "That's bold of you," she murmured, eyes lowering to the table. "Not bold," I said. "Just honest." The space between our hands felt impossibly narrow now. Inches, maybe less. The warmth from her cup drifted toward me, mingling with the scent of chamomile and the faint lavender that clung to her scarf. Her shoulders eased, but her breath caught, just barely, as if weighing every reason to push this moment away against every part of her that didn't want to. "I don't know if I should let you say things like that," she whispered, finally looking up at me again. I held her gaze, steady but not forceful. "You don't have to let me. You only have to hear me." Something shifted then, not a confession, not a step across forbidden ground, but a shared understanding. The line was still there, yes, but now it felt less like a barrier and more like a thread, thin, delicate, waiting to see which way the wind would pull it. Her hand moved slowly, almost absent-mindedly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. It brought her fingers just a little closer to mine, and though they didn't touch, the heat between them felt alive. Outside, the rain softened. Inside, the quiet stretched, no longer tense, just suspended, like a moment deciding whether to end or to stay. She finally broke it with a faint smile. "You've grown up," she said, the words carrying more weight than they should have. "Maybe," I replied. "Or maybe I just see things more clearly now." And for the first time that evening, she didn't look away. The air had turned colder in the weeks that followed. Autumn was slipping quietly into winter, each evening carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp leaves. We had fallen into a rhythm of chance meetings that no longer felt like chance. Bookstores, quiet streets, the riverside path that curved behind the old stone bridge. That night, we walked along the river, our breaths rising in small white clouds. The lampposts threw soft circles of light onto the pavement, and the city felt muted, just the hush of water, the occasional ripple of wind. Claire pulled her coat tighter and laughed softly. "I can't believe I let you talk me into a walk this late," she said. "You needed fresh air," I replied, smiling. "And I needed company." She glanced at me, her lips curving, but her eyes carrying something else, hesitation, perhaps, or the edge of a thought she hadn't given permission to speak. After a while, the conversation turned quieter. We spoke about her work, how the school was changing, how the faces in her classroom seemed both familiar and entirely new each year. Then, her voice lowered, softer than the wind. "You know," she said, "it's not always easy. Being here, now. After the divorce, everyone has their opinions, friends, colleagues. They wonder why I keep my distance, why I don't just start over." I listened, letting her words find their way into the cold air between us. "And why don't you?" I asked gently. She exhaled, a slow, visible breath. "Because it feels like every move I make is under a lens. Age, reputation, the idea of what's appropriate, it's a cage some days." There was a vulnerability there I hadn't seen before. The woman who once seemed unshakable in front of 30 restless students now stood beside me with her guard lowered, even if only for a moment. Without thinking too much, I slipped my jacket from my shoulders and draped it around her. "Here," I said quietly. "If the world wants to judge you, let it. Tonight, it's just cold, and you shouldn't have to carry that alone." She paused, her hands clutching the edges of the jacket, holding it close. For a heartbeat she didn't move, just stood there, eyes lowered, lips parting as if 100 words wanted to escape but none felt safe enough to. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost a whisper. "You make it sound so simple. Maybe it doesn't have to be complicated," I said. We kept walking, our arms brushing now and then, the contact small but grounding. The line she had once spoken of was still there, I knew. But it no longer felt like a warning etched in stone. It felt like a thread caught between our hands, fragile, waiting, asking not to be broken. And in that quiet moment by the river, with the city lights shimmering in the dark water, I realized this was what intimacy really was, not the rush of crossing a boundary, but the stillness of standing near one together. Winter came quietly that year. The first snow was light, dusting the streets like powdered glass. Strings of warm lights had begun to appear across the city, shops dressing their windows for the festival season. It was in this glow that I saw her again, not by chance this time, but because she had asked. The city square was alive that evening, soft music, the scent of roasted chestnuts, children laughing as they chased one another around the glowing fountain. Claire stood near the heart of it all, her scarf wrapped high, a trace of pink on her cheeks from the cold. When she saw me, her expression softened into something that wasn't surprise anymore. It was something steadier, something that had been building quietly across all those evenings and silences. "You came," she said, her breath visible in the winter air. "Of course," I replied. "I said I would." We walked through the square slowly, letting the crowd drift around us. There was no urgency now, no need to force a moment. It was already here, in the way our steps matched without trying, in the way her shoulder brushed mine as the crowd swayed. She stopped near a stall selling mulled cider. "Do you ever wonder how people will see this?" she asked, her eyes fixed on the glow of the cups being filled. "How they'll talk, if they even care to." I thought about that, about whispers, about lines drawn by people who weren't here to feel this cold, this quiet, this calm. Maybe, I said, but I think I care more about how we see it. She turned then, slowly, her eyes catching the reflection of the festival lights. For once, there was no guardianess there, no teacher weighing the consequences, no woman shielding herself from the ache of being misread. Just Claire, standing with her hands wrapped around a warm cup, looking at me as though the world outside had finally quieted. I offered my hand, palm open, fingers steady. No lines, I said gently. Just this. She looked down at it for a heartbeat, then slipped her fingers into mine. The warmth was immediate, and something inside me eased, like a held breath finally released. We stood like that as the music swelled and the first fireworks cracked open the night sky. Her cheek brushed against my shoulder, as she leaned in slightly, the wool of her scarf soft against my neck. I felt the steady rhythm of her breathing, the subtle pressure of her hand tightening around mine. There was no confession, no dramatic declaration. Just a quiet choice made beneath winter lights, among strangers who didn't look twice. I think, she whispered, almost to herself, this is the first time in a long while I feel present. I smiled, turning slightly so she could hear me over the noise. Then maybe that's all that matters. And as the snow began to fall again, gentle and unhurried, either of us moved to step away.